Create and edit a sketch. In this video, we'll create a sketch, apply a sketch dimension, apply a sketch constraint, and use sketch parameters. In Fusion 360, we want to carry on with our first upload CAD design. This design already contains a sketch and a feature, in this case an extrude. We now want to take a look at ways in which we can create new sketches and new sketch elements. To get started, we need either a plane or a planar face. Fusion 360 already has a default origin that contains an XY, an XZ, and a YZ plane. Any of these can be used as a sketch plane, or since we already have an extrude, we can use faces of this design. We can either pre-select the faces, or we can select Create Sketch. I'm going to select Create Sketch, then I want to select the front face of the current box. I'm going to use my middle mouse button by pressing it down and panning till I'm roughly in the center of the screen, and then I'll zoom in a little bit. Whenever we select a face to be used as a sketch plane, Fusion 360 automatically brings in those sketch elements. If I were to hide the bodies, you'll notice that there is a faint blue outline on the screen. This is a closed profile that's represented by the outside edges of the face that I selected to make my sketch. I'm going to bring the body back, but just note that we've created a sketch profile, and no more is needed for us to create a sketch extrude, a revolve, or some other type of solid geometry. We want to note that when we're in the sketching environment, we're automatically prompted with a sketch palette on the right side that gives us some information and configuration in the sketching environment. We can use Look At if we were to ever rotate our view and we want to go back to normal view to our sketch plane. We can also toggle on and off the sketch grid, whether or not we want to snap to it, and whether or not we want to slice through solid geometry based on our current sketch plane. We can also show the profile, which is what's currently creating our closed profile sketch. We can show points, we can show dimensions, constraints, projected geometry, and even toggle on the 3D sketch option. We can also determine whether or not we want line types to be construction or center lines. From here, let's talk about ways in which we can create sketch elements. Sketch elements or entities are going to be the things that we use to define our solid geometry. You'll notice at the top that we still have our solid, surface, and sheet metal tabs, but now we have access to sketch tools. Under Create, there are many different types of sketch entities that we can use. The first is to take a look at the Line tool. When we select the Line tool, we can begin by selecting the first point. This can be freely placed in space, or we can select other geometry. Note that as I drag this along this upper edge, there's an X icon. This is going to create a constraint between the end of my line and the selected entity. As I get closer to the middle of it, that icon changes to a triangle, which is a midpoint constraint. I'm going to start by placing the line along the top edge somewhere off to the left, and then I'm going to begin dragging it down to the origin. When I get to the origin, notice that it's snapping in place. Once again, this is placing a constraint. Let's hit Escape to get off of our Line tool. The line is currently blue because it's underdefined. The endpoint here is constrained at the origin. However, this endpoint is free to move back and forth across this line. Also note that now we have two profiles. This is because our line is creating a division between our previously created rectangular profile. If we want to fully define this line, we can either add a constraint by dragging it to another location, or by adding a constraint based on our constraints menu, or by using dimensions to fully constrain it. In this case, I'm going to begin by adding a sketch dimension. By selecting sketch dimension, I can grab the line and I can give it a horizontal or vertical or a line dimension, or I can select another entity to give it an angular dimension. In this case, I'm going to add 45 degrees and hit enter to OK this. Notice now that the line has turned black, meaning it's fully defined. I'm going to hit Escape to get off of my Dimension tool. Let's add some additional sketch elements. By going to Create, next I'm going to select Arc. I'm going to use the 3-point arc, starting at the end point of my line. When I do this, I need to select the second point, which is going to be my end point, and notice at a certain instance that we're getting a tangency constraint automatically applied. If I left click and then I hit escape to get off my arc tool, you'll notice that the tangent constraint has automatically been applied. However, the arc is still underdefined. We can define it by, again, giving it dimensions or constraints. We have an underdefined endpoint as well as a midpoint for an arc. I'm going to select the constraint for the midpoint. I'm going to place the center of my arc at the midpoint of this vertical edge. We'll hit escape to get off of our constraint tool, and note that the arc is now black, however the endpoint is a small white vertex. This is because the endpoint is still free to move about. I'm going to move it until it comes into contact with this edge. I can use Control or Shift to select the bottom edge, and then I can apply a coincident constraint. We could also use dimensions to fully define our sketch geometry. For example, if I grab the center diameter circle tool, and I select a point to place it, I can begin to drag it out and notice a dimension is highlighted in blue. I'm going to manually enter a value of 25 millimeters and hit enter to get off of my circle tool. You can see now that we were able to create a couple of sketch entities. Let's finish this sketch, expand our sketches folder, and let's hide it. The next thing that I want to do is I want to talk about another way in which we can define sketches, and that's by using sketch parameters. Under the Modify dropdown, we have an option called Change Parameters. I'm going to drag this into the middle of the screen, and I'm going to begin expanding the model parameters, Sketch 2, and note that we have our 45-degree dimension and our 25 millimeter dimension that were applied to the sketch we just created. We can also use the user parameters by hitting the plus icon and begin defining new parameters we want to define our sketches. I'm going to start typing in whole DIA for diameter, and I'm going to enter a value of 35 millimeters. We're going to say OK. We're going to OK our change parameters dialog, and then I'm going to select the top face of my box, right click, and create a new sketch. By using my center diameter circle, I'm going to place it at the origin, and as I begin to drag away, instead of manually entering a dimension value, I'm going to start to type in the letter H. This brings up my parameter list. H because whole diameter starts with the letter H, and once we select our whole diameter, I can hit enter, and now this is linked to our user parameter. That parameter has an fx in front of it, which allows us to understand that this is a parameter that was defined, and it's automatically linked to that list. If I finish my sketch, go back to Modify and Change Parameters, and I drag this slightly out of the way, I can modify this value. For example, I can change it to 45 millimeters, hit enter, and now it updates on the screen. This is extremely handy if we begin creating designs that have specific dimensions or constraints that we need to apply. For example, a specific size, a whole dimension, or a pattern. From here, we are going to be exploring sketching and creating geometry, but let's navigate back to a home view and make sure that we save this design before moving on.